I thought life was simple: work hard, love your family, and stay true to the people who matter to you. Then I met Leah, confident, exciting, and unlike anyone I'd ever known. She turned my life upside down, and for a while, I thought I'd found everything I'd ever wanted. But behind her smile was a secret I didn't expect, a secret that changed everything. How do you move on when the person you trusted most breaks you? I was born in a small, sun-drenched village tucked into the northern hills of Italy, where the scent of olive trees mingled with the sea breeze. Life moved at its own pace there. No one was ever in a hurry, except perhaps the chefs in the kitchens. My family ran a restaurant that had been in our blood for 3 generations, Trattoria di Bella Vita. It wasn't just a business, it was the heart of our family and, in many ways, the soul of our town. The trattoria was more than just a place to eat. It was where love blossomed over candlelit dinners, where deals were sealed with hearty handshakes, and where friendships were forged over glasses of Chianti. My earliest memories were of that place: my father, Marco, rolling out pasta dough on the marble counter, my mother, Emilia, carefully plating tiramisu with the precision of an artist. The clinking of wine glasses and the hum of lively conversation were the soundtrack of my childhood. My father was a man who believed in hard work and tradition above all else. He was big on lessons, constantly dishing out pieces of advice like they were part of a sacred recipe passed down through generations. One of his favorite sayings was, "Nicola, respect the family, respect traditions, and you'll never go hungry." He'd say it with flour-dusted hands and a serious look that told me he meant every word. And I believed him. By the time I was 12, I was no stranger to the kitchen. At first, it was small tasks: peeling garlic, washing basil leaves, and carrying trays to the dining room. But soon, my father started teaching me the basics of our family recipes, the ones he swore we had inherited from his grandmother. "Cooking isn't just about food, Nicola," he would say, his hands expertly kneading dough. "It's about love, patience, and respect. That's what people taste when they eat here." At 13, when most of my friends were kicking a soccer ball around the piazza, I was learning how to manage the trattoria on a busy Friday night. I learned to think on my feet, how to calm a frustrated customer, fix a broken wine opener, and even how to handle a waiter who didn't show up for his shift. My father would often stand in the corner of the kitchen, arms crossed, watching me with a sharp but proud eye. He rarely gave praise, but when he did, it meant something. My mother, on the other hand, was the heart of the family. Where my father was stern and serious, she was warm and nurturing, balancing him out like the perfect mix of olive oil and vinegar. She'd hum Italian lullabies while folding napkins, and no matter how chaotic the trattoria got, she'd always find time to bring me a plate of her gnocchi al pomodoro, her way of reminding me to take care of myself even amidst the madness. My younger brother, Luca, was as different from me as night was from day. While I buried myself in the responsibilities of the restaurant, Luca was the charmer. He had a knack for getting away with things, whether it was sneaking biscotti from the pantry or convincing our parents to let him stay out late. "You work too hard, Nick," he'd say, grinning as he stole a breadstick off the counter. "Life's short, have some fun." But for all his teasing, Luca had a good heart. He'd help me close up the restaurant at night, joking about how one day he'd marry a rich woman so he wouldn't have to lift a finger. When I turned 18, my father did something that caught me off guard. After dinner one night, he handed me a set of keys, old, bronze ones that gleamed under the kitchen lights. "These are yours now," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "It's for the trattoria in San Pietro. You've earned it." San Pietro was a smaller town about 30 minutes away, with a sleepy main square and a trattoria that was far less glamorous than our family's main restaurant. But it was mine, and I threw myself into it with everything I had. At first, it was rough. The place had been neglected, and business was slow. But I remembered my father's words: respect the family, respect traditions. So I poured my soul into it. I revamped the menu, spruced up the decor, and introduced cooking classes to bring in more locals. Little by little, the place came alive, and by my mid-20s, it was thriving. I was proud of what I'd built, but I never lost sight of where I'd come from. Every Sunday, I'd return to the original trattoria to sit at the family table. My father would grill me about the week's earnings while my mother fussed over whether I was eating enough. Luca would usually show up late, as always, flashing his usual grin and cracking jokes to lighten the mood. By the time I turned 30, life felt like it had fallen into place. I had carved out my own path while staying true to the traditions that shaped me. I was confident, successful, and content in my routine. But life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. It was at a wine-tasting event in the heart of Tuscany, surrounded by the rolling vineyards and golden sunlight, that my world shifted. That was where I met Leah. I still remember the day I met Leah as vividly as if it happened yesterday. It was late spring, the kind of warm day when the sunlight dances off the cobblestones and the scent of blooming jasmine lingers in the air. I had been invited to a wine-tasting event in Tuscany by a supplier who was eager to showcase his latest vintages. Normally, I'd have sent one of my managers in my place. I wasn't much for social events, but something compelled me to go that day. The event was held at an estate nestled deep in the Tuscan hills. Rows of grapevines stretched out as far as the eye could see, and the chatter of well-dressed guests filled the courtyard. I felt slightly out of place in my simple linen shirt and slacks, surrounded by people who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine. But I reminded myself I wasn't here to impress anyone, I was here for the wine. I was sampling a glass of Barolo when I saw her. She wasn't the kind of woman who simply blended into a crowd. There was something about her presence that commanded attention without trying. Her hair was a cascade of dark waves that caught the sunlight, and her sharp, tailored dress hinted at a confident, purposeful woman. She stood near a table, swirling a glass of white wine and nodding thoughtfully as a sommelier spoke to her. I don't know what it was about her that drew me in. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, like she belonged in every room she walked into. Or maybe it was her laugh, warm and unrestrained, which drifted through the crowd like music. Whatever it was, I found myself moving toward her before I'd even realized what I was doing. "Quite the selection today," I said casually, raising my glass. She turned to me, her storm gray eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. "It is," she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't quite place. "But I find most of the whites too sweet for my taste. I prefer something with a bit more complexity." I smiled. "Then I hope you've tried the Barolo. It's complex enough to keep you guessing but bold enough to leave an impression." Her lips curved into a faint smile, and she held out her glass. "I suppose I'll have to take your word for it, then." The next few minutes passed in a blur. We exchanged introductions. Her name was Leah, short for Liana, and she worked in design. She didn't say much about what kind of design, but the way she spoke about her work made it clear she was passionate about it. I told her about the trattoria, and to my surprise, she seemed genuinely interested. "Running a restaurant seems like such a romantic life," she said, tilting her head slightly. "It's a lot of late nights and endless headaches," I admitted. "But I suppose there's romance in that too." Her laugh was soft but infectious. "You're honest. I like that." We ended up spending most of the event together, wandering through the estate and sampling wines. Leah wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. She had a way of drawing people in with her sharp wit and an easy confidence that made you want to keep talking to her. It didn't take long for me to learn that she was unlike anyone I'd ever met. While I'd spent my life rooted in tradition and family, she was the opposite, ambitious, independent, and always on the move. She traveled frequently for her work, designing interiors for high-end hotels and luxury residences. Her stories were filled with exotic locations and spontaneous adventures, a stark contrast to the predictable rhythm of my life. But what struck me most was the way she looked at the world. Leah wasn't content with the ordinary. She craved excitement, beauty, and experiences that pushed the boundaries of what life could offer. It was both intoxicating and intimidating. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the vineyard in hues of gold and amber, I realized I didn't want the day to end. I had never been one to take risks when it came to relationships. I was methodical, the kind of man who liked to weigh the pros and cons before committing. But something about Leah made me want to throw caution to the wind. As the event wound down, I found myself standing with her near the edge of the vineyard, the stars beginning to dot the evening sky. "It's a beautiful night," I said, though my focus was entirely on her. "It is," she agreed, her gaze lingering on mine for a moment too long. For the first time in years, I felt a nervousness I couldn't explain. Would it be too forward of me to ask if I could see you again? Her smile widened, and for a moment, I thought she was going to say no. But then she nodded. I think I'd like that, Nicola. And just like that, something shifted in my world. Leah and I began seeing each other not long after that wine-tasting event. At first, our worlds seemed so different that I couldn't imagine how we'd fit together. She lived in motion, always hopping between cities, staying in chic hotels, and navigating a world of creative ambition. I was deeply rooted, a man of steady habits and predictable routines. But somehow, it worked. When she was with me, Leah seemed to embrace the charm of my quieter life. She'd sit at the counter of the trattoria while I worked late, sketching in her notebook as the kitchen buzzed around her. She said the noise of the restaurant, the sizzling pans, the clinking glasses, the bursts of laughter from diners, was inspiring. And when I closed up for the night, we'd share a glass of wine and talk about everything from her latest design project to the traditions that defined my family. I'd never met anyone like her. Leah didn't just exist in the world, she challenged it. She had opinions on everything, from art to politics to food, and she wasn't afraid to share them. She questioned my way of life, not to criticize it, but to understand it. And in doing so, she made me see parts of myself I hadn't before. Within a year, I knew I wanted to marry her. My family, however, wasn't so sure. When I brought Leah home for the first time, the tension was palpable. My mother, Emilia, tried to be polite, but it was clear she didn't approve. She thought Leah was too independent, too modern. She doesn't seem like the type to settle down, Nicola, she told me later that evening, her voice heavy with concern. You need someone who understands what it means to build a life together, not someone who's always chasing the next adventure. My father, typically reserved, said little, but his silence spoke volumes. Even Luca, who usually supported me no matter what, gave me a knowing look that said, "Are you sure about this?" But I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I wasn't looking for approval. I was in love, and I was certain that Leah was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. We got married in a small ceremony in Tuscany, surrounded by vineyards and a handful of close friends. My parents were there, of course, though my mother's smile felt forced in the wedding photos. Leah wore a simple, elegant dress that made her look like she had stepped out of a dream. As we exchanged vows under the golden Italian sun, I couldn't imagine anything that could go wrong. The early years of our marriage were a whirlwind. Leah's work took her to places I'd only read about, Paris, Dubai, Tokyo, and sometimes, when the trattoria allowed, I'd join her. Those trips opened my eyes to a world beyond the confines of my family's traditions. Leah showed me modern architecture, Michelin-starred restaurants, and art galleries that left me speechless. But for all the excitement, there were challenges too. Leah wasn't the type to stay still, and her ambition often kept her on the move. I didn't mind at first, I was proud of her drive, her ability to make a name for herself in such a competitive industry. But her absence was felt more and more as the years went on. When Leah was home, life was beautiful. She'd throw herself into the trattoria, suggesting small design tweaks to make the space feel more inviting. A splash of color here, she'd say, pointing to the walls, or, you need better lighting above the bar. Her ideas were always spot on, and the restaurant flourished with her influence. But when she was away, I felt the weight of her absence like a physical ache. It wasn't just the loneliness, it was the sense that her world and mine were slowly drifting apart. She'd come back from her trips full of stories about clients and colleagues, about parties in penthouses and cocktails on yachts. Meanwhile, my stories were about balancing the books, training new staff, and dealing with the occasional angry customer. It's not a competition, Leah said one night when I voiced my insecurities. Your world is just as important as mine, Nick. You keep things grounded. You keep us grounded. I wanted to believe her. But then there were the fights, small at first, like cracks in a foundation. They were about silly things, why she didn't call when she said she would, or why I couldn't drop everything to join her on a trip. I hated arguing with her. I hated how it made us both say things we didn't mean. But most of all, I hated how the fights left me feeling like I was holding onto something I couldn't quite name. Still, we always found our way back to each other. She'd apologize, I'd apologize, and we'd promise to do better. And for a while, it worked. By the time we reached our 5th anniversary, I thought we'd weathered the worst of it. I'd learned to adapt to her unpredictable schedule, and she'd made an effort to spend more time at home. We even started talking about the possibility of expanding the trattoria or maybe opening a second location in the city. But looking back, I see now that the cracks were already there. I just wasn't ready to see them yet. At first, the changes in Leah were subtle. I didn't even notice them at the time, or maybe I chose not to. She was always independent, always busy, so when she started working later hours or extending her trips by a day or two, I brushed it off. It's just the demands of her job, I told myself. She's ambitious, this is what I signed up for. But the distance between us wasn't just physical. Leah began to pull away in other ways too. Conversations that once flowed easily now felt forced. When I'd ask about her day, her answers were vague, clipped. She spent more time scrolling through her phone, her expression unreadable, and less time lingering in the kitchen with me as I cooked. I tried to ignore it. I told myself every couple goes through phases, that we were just busy, distracted by the pressures of work and life. But doubt has a way of creeping in, no matter how hard you try to keep it at bay. The first real red flag came on a quiet Tuesday night. I had closed the trattoria early to surprise Leah with dinner at home. I made her favorite, veal saltimbocca with a side of roasted asparagus, and paired it with a bottle of Brunello di Montalcino we'd been saving. When she walked in the door, I could tell she was tired, but there was something else in her expression, something distant, almost guarded. "This is a nice surprise," she said, setting her bag down. She kissed me on the cheek, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. We sat at the table, the candlelight casting a warm glow over the room. I told her about my day, about the new supplier I was considering working with, but she seemed distracted. Her phone buzzed once, then again, and each time she glanced at it, her face tightened. "Work?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah," she said quickly, sliding the phone into her bag. "Just some emails I need to deal with later." I let it go, but the moment lingered. For the first time, I felt like there was a wall between us, something I couldn't quite reach past. Then there were her trips. Leah had always traveled frequently for work, but now it felt like she was gone more often than she was home. "It's a big project," she explained one night as she packed her suitcase. "A huge opportunity for me. If it goes well, it could mean a promotion." I nodded, forcing a smile. "You've worked hard for this, Leah. You deserve it." But as I watched her zip up her bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The first real jolt came from Luca. He had always been more intuitive than he let on, despite his laid-back demeanor. One evening, he stopped by the trattoria to help me close up. "Nick, can I ask you something?" he said, leaning against the counter as I wiped down the espresso machine. "Of course. Is everything okay with Leah?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I saw her the other night. At La Pergola." I frowned. "That's odd. She was supposed to be out of town for work." Luca's expression darkened. "She wasn't alone, Nick. She was with some guy." I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but they looked close. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The room felt too quiet, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly deafening. "You must have been mistaken," I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. "She doesn't even like La Pergola." "Maybe," Luca said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it any more than I did. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Luca's words echoed in my mind. Was he right? Was there something going on? I wanted to believe Leah. I wanted to trust that whatever distance I felt between us was temporary, fixable. But doubt had planted itself in my chest, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, it refused to go away. The tipping point came a few weeks later. Leah had just returned from another one of her trips, and as I unpacked her bag to help, a small, unfamiliar item tumbled out, a key card for a luxury hotel. My heart sank. I held it in my hand, staring at the logo stamped on the card. It wasn't a hotel we'd ever visited together, and the dates printed on it didn't match the itinerary she'd shared with me. "Where did this come from?" I asked when she came into the room. My voice was steady, but inside, my heart was pounding. Leah's eyes flicked to the card, and for a split second, I saw something in her expression: panic, guilt, or maybe just surprise. "Oh, that," she said quickly. "It must have been from the team. We had a meeting there one afternoon, and they gave us rooms to use if we needed to freshen up. I must have forgotten it in my bag." Her explanation was smooth, almost too smooth, but I forced myself to believe it. I didn't want to accuse her of something so terrible without proof. But I couldn't shake the unease. I confided in Luca the next day, and his face hardened when I told him about the key card. "You need to find out what's really going on, Nick," he said. "You can't let this eat away at you." Reluctantly, I agreed. I wasn't proud of what came next, but I was desperate for answers. I asked Luca to help me hire someone, a professional who could find out if there was more to Leah's trips than she was letting on. For the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. The waiting was the worst part. Once Luca helped me hire a private investigator, every passing hour felt like a lifetime. I found myself scrutinizing everything Leah did, every glance at her phone, every delay in her answers, every vague, "I'll be working late" text. I hated myself for it. I hated that I couldn't look at her without wondering if she was lying to me. But more than that, I hated the knot of suspicion tightening in my chest, a quiet whisper that kept telling me I already knew the truth, even if I didn't want to admit it. It didn't take long for the investigator to find something. One afternoon, a week after I'd hired him, he called me while I was prepping ingredients for the evening rush at the trattoria. "Nicola," he said, his voice calm and measured, "I've got something you need to see." He sent me an email with photos attached. My hands trembled as I opened the file, a sinking feeling settling in my stomach. The first image showed Leah stepping out of a luxury hotel in the city. Her hair was loose, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. But it wasn't her expression that caught my eye, it was the man walking beside her. He was tall, dark-haired, and impeccably dressed. His hand rested lightly on her lower back, and they looked so comfortable together that it made my chest ache. The other photos told the same story. There were shots of them laughing over dinner at an outdoor cafe, holding hands as they strolled through a park, and finally, entering the same hotel late at night. The timestamps left no room for doubt, they had spent the night together. The man's name, the investigator later told me, was Raul. He was one of Leah's clients, a wealthy businessman from Spain. They've been meeting regularly for months, the investigator said. Always during her work trips. I stared at the photos, my heart pounding in my chest, my throat dry. It was like the floor had been ripped out from under me. Leah wasn't just lying to me, she was living an entirely separate life, one I had no part in. That night, I didn't confront her. I couldn't. She came home late, kissed me on the cheek, and slipped into bed without a word. I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the evidence pressing down on me like a boulder. The next day, I called Luca and told him everything. He listened in silence, and when I finished, he swore under his breath. "She doesn't deserve you, Nick," he said. "We need to do something about this. You can't let her get away with it." "What can I do?" I asked, my voice hollow. "She's already destroyed everything." But Luca wasn't one to sit back and do nothing. He had always been the impulsive one, the hot-headed brother who acted first and thought later. "Leave it to me," he said. "I'll take care of it." I should have stopped him, but part of me was too numb to care. A few days later, Luca called me again. "Raul's staying at the same hotel tomorrow night," he said. "I've got some guys who can give him a message." "Luca," I said, my voice sharp, "this isn't the answer." "It's not about revenge, Nick," he said. "It's about making sure he knows he messed with the wrong family." I hesitated, torn between anger and reason. But in the end, I didn't stop him. The next day, Raul was escorted out of the city by a couple of Luca's friends. He wasn't seriously hurt, just bruised, humiliated, and warned never to come near Leah or me again. It wasn't until later that I realized how little satisfaction it brought me. Raul wasn't the only one to blame. Leah had made her choices, too. I knew I couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. On the night of our wedding anniversary, I invited Leah to dinner at the trattoria. She looked radiant when she arrived, dressed in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure. For a moment, I felt a pang of longing, a reminder of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But as we sat down at the table, surrounded by the flicker of candlelight, the weight of what I knew was too much to bear. I waited until the food had been served, until the wine had been poured. Then I reached into my bag and placed the folder of evidence on the table between us. "What's this?" Leah asked, her smile faltering. "Open it," I said, my voice cold and steady. She hesitated, then flipped through the photos and reports. Her face went pale, her hands trembling as she tried to explain. "Nick, I can explain," she stammered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't what it looks like. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake." I leaned back in my chair, my arms crossed. "It wasn't just one night, Leah. It was months. And you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." Tears filled her eyes as she reached across the table for my hand. "Please, Nick. It didn't mean anything. I love you. I only love you." Her words rang hollow, like the echo of a bell that had already cracked. "You didn't just destroy us," I said, my voice low but firm. "You destroyed yourself." I stood up, leaving the evidence on the table. "You'll hear from my lawyer," I said before walking out of the restaurant. That was the last time I saw her before I filed for divorce. The silence that followed our confrontation was deafening. Leah didn't call, didn't show up at the trattoria, and didn't even come home that night. Not that I expected her to, I had made my intentions clear. When I returned to our house the next day, the emptiness of it hit me like a punch to the gut. Her shoes weren't by the door. Her favorite scarf wasn't draped over the chair in the hallway. It was as if she'd vanished, leaving behind nothing but the ghost of the life we'd built together. But she hadn't vanished entirely. A week later, a courier delivered divorce papers to her workplace. I'd instructed my lawyer to include everything: division of property, dissolution of our joint accounts, and a clause that explicitly stated she would have no claim to the trattoria. Her response came quickly. She called me, her voice trembling with anger and desperation. "Nick, don't do this," she pleaded. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever it takes." But there was nothing to fix. Her betrayal had shattered something that couldn't be repaired. "It's too late, Leah," I said, my voice cold and final. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She tried to argue, to bargain, even to guilt me. "I gave up so much for you, for us," she said. "I thought you'd at least try to understand." "Understand?" I snapped, my composure finally breaking. "You lied to me for months, Leah. You humiliated me. And you want me to understand? No. You don't get to play the victim here." After that, there was nothing left to say. The divorce moved quickly, thanks to my lawyer's thoroughness and Leah's lack of options. By the time the papers were signed, her world had unraveled as much as mine. The joint accounts were frozen, leaving her to rely on her own income. She moved into a small apartment across town, and the friends who once admired her glamorous life seemed to vanish overnight. Word of her affair spread through our small community like wildfire. People talked, whispered, and cast judgment. For someone like Leah, who thrived on admiration, the humiliation must have been unbearable. As for Raoul, he disappeared without a trace. Luca's message had been effective, and whatever feelings Leah might have had for him didn't seem to matter anymore. He was gone, leaving her to face the fallout on her own. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to hate her entirely. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when I'd find myself remembering the Leah I fell in love with. The woman who sat at the trattoria counter, sketching in her notebook and smiling at me like I was the only person in the world. But those memories felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder of what I'd lost. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the trattoria to distract myself from the ache in my chest. The restaurant became my sanctuary, a place where I could focus on something tangible and leave the chaos of my personal life at the door. Luca was a constant presence during those days, his easygoing nature a source of comfort I didn't know I needed. He never pried, never asked how I was holding up. Instead, he showed up with a six-pack of beer or a plate of pasta and sat with me in the quiet moments after closing time. "You'll get through this, Nick," he said one night as we sat in the empty dining room. "You're stronger than you think." I wanted to believe him. It wasn't until a few months later that I finally began to feel like myself again. The pain didn't go away entirely, it never does, but it dulled to a manageable ache, something I could live with. I stopped checking my phone for messages from Leah, stopped replaying the arguments and the betrayals in my mind. One evening, as I locked up the trattoria, I found myself standing in the dim light of the street, staring up at the stars. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a strange sense of peace. Leah had broken something in me, yes. But she hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, still breathing, still capable of rebuilding the life she'd tried to tear apart. Months after the divorce, life settled into a new rhythm. The trattoria became my lifeline, a place to rebuild, to focus, to forget. Luca urged me to dream bigger, to open a second location, but I wasn't ready to take risks again. At least, not yet. Then came Giulia. She walked into the trattoria one evening, asking for a slice of tiramisu just before closing. There was something unassuming yet magnetic about her, the kind of warmth that didn't demand attention but quietly earned it. As we talked, I found myself laughing for the first time in months. She listened without judgment, offering the kind of understanding I didn't know I needed. Giulia worked in social services, helping children rebuild their lives. Her calm confidence was a stark contrast to the chaos Leah had brought into mine. Over time, she became a steady presence in my life, a reminder that not all connections are fleeting. One night, as we shared a quiet dinner on the trattoria terrace, she reached for my hand and said, "You've been through hell, Nick. But look at you, you're still standing." Her words stayed with me. With Giulia's quiet encouragement, I opened a sleek second trattoria and watched it thrive. The weight of Leah's betrayal began to lift, replaced by the hope of something new. Leah tried to reach out a few times, her messages filled with apologies and pleas for a second chance. I never responded. There was nothing left to say. As Giulia and I walked along the cobblestone streets one evening, she stopped suddenly, her hand brushing mine. "Nick," she said, her eyes searching mine, "I'm proud of you, for how far you've come." For the first time in years, I felt proud of myself too.